behalf of Chester Made, my name is Devin Walls. I am the Executive Director of MJ Free Performing Arts Theater just down the street in Chester. For a few years now, myself and all of our Chester Made partners have been working on this endeavor, and we've been talking a lot about arts, we've been talking a lot about history, and tonight we're going to talk about whose history it is. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of university representation from Swarthmore and Widener University in the building. Myself, Laurie Zier, who is the Director of PA Humanities, Butch Slaughter, and everyone else. We just want to thank y'all. And tonight we're going to answer the question, hopefully, whose history is it anyway? Ulysses?
Laurie, you're up.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, I'm Laurie. I'm from the Delaware County Historical Society, and we're thrilled to be able to host this. And we thank Ulysses for letting us host this. This is a really relevant question for a historical society. Whose history is this anyway? And just by way of example, on Monday, we had a resident from Aston come in and bring a donation that was found on his great-uncle Samuel Tyron's farm from Tyron Lane. And what he brought in were arrowheads and scrapers and I guess they're hammers that were dated back 15,000 years ago. And so that truly makes you think, whose history is this anyhow? Or anyway, so thanks for coming, and please look around.
All right, I'm going to come up here so that the mirror can see me in the camera. All right, my name is Ulysses Butch Slaughter. Again, I want to thank you. I'm the program manager for Chester Made, and tonight's program is hosted by Chester Made. Bear with me, because we got a lot of people to thank for helping us put this together. We want to make sure that everybody knows how much we appreciate their support in helping us put this together. So, tonight's program is hosted by Chester Made, Pennsylvania Humanities Council, and Delaware County Historical Society. It's part of a national initiative to strengthen democracy through the humanities and engage journalism. Here in Pennsylvania, that initiative is focused in two communities. We got Chester here and our sister community of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Together, we're exploring questions like, how do journalists, historians, grassroots organizations, and residents all contribute to telling us a community's story and motivating meaningful change? What are the challenges communities face in sustaining a sense of place in ways that are inclusive of all of our differences and shared humanity? Tonight is the first in a series of events in Chester and in Carlisle. And we hope that we will tell a stronger and more inclusive story as a result. We're calling this A Tale of Two Cities. We made that up. No, I'm serious. And as we move into the future, this is the first event, and we need your feedback. So at the end, close to the end, we got some evaluations we're going to want you to fill out, because we want to do it better the next time that we do it. So we will have some evaluations for you. I want to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their generous support of this initiative, as well as the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership. Thank you to the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, Lori, I see Ken here. Thank you all for the work that you've done with the residents to put the humanities into action here in Chester. And thank you also again, Delaware County Historical Society, for hosting this event. And thanks to everyone involved with Chester Made, including Chester Made Partners, the City of Chester, Artist Warehouse, and Widener University. It is already 6:50, and one Steven Hahn is supposed to be up here. But I'm going to introduce you, tell you a little bit about him, and then get him up here because he is going to kick this off. Steven Hahn is currently Professor of History at New York University. He is a specialist on the international history of slavery, emancipation, and race, on the construction of the American Empire, and on the social, Stephen, tell me if I get something wrong here, please. Okay, good. Social political history of the long 19th century in the United States. He has written for a variety of papers, including the New York Times, and is author of more than 4 books, including A Nation Under Our Feet, Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration. That one won the Pulitzer Prize in 2004. Mr. Hahn has been actively involved in projects making history and liberal arts education available to a wider public, and is currently teaching in NYU's prison education program. Let's get Mr. Hahn up here. Would you like to sit down here or here? Oh, look at here. Hello. Hello.
No, it's not on.
It's not on yet? You gotta turn this in. Hello.
Wait, you gotta turn that.
Hello. Hello.
All right. Hello. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming to this event. Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay in the back? Thank you for that introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversations very shortly after my remarks. I should begin by saying, and you probably got a sense of this from Ulysses' introduction, that I'm not a scholar of Chester, Pennsylvania's rich history, and so my remarks that I'm going to use to kick off our discussion are actually come out of an episode that took place 150 years ago this fall in, of all places, Southwest Georgia. But I picked this episode for several reasons that I hope become relevant in our discussion and for the subject. The first is, as some of you know, this is currently the 150th anniversary of the period we call Reconstruction, a period that is pivotal in the history of the United States, but also one that is incredibly misunderstood by much of the public, including the very well-educated public, and it's important to revisit precisely for that reason. The second reason I picked this is that, as many of you know, when we think about the many thousands of African Americans who migrated to Philadelphia and to Chester, many of them came from places like Georgia, Florida and the Carolinas, as well as Virginia and the Chesapeake. And so Georgia is a place of origin, and the history of Georgia is a relevant history for all of us here. Thirdly, there was an election last night, some of you may know, and one in Georgia that is still not resolved, but it certainly reminds us of the long shadow that Reconstruction casts over our history to this day. So let me just, I won't take too long, but let me just tell a little story about this episode and see if I can use it as a way to speak to the larger issues today. I think it'll be easier for me to use this because I have paper. It's generally been called a riot, the bloodletting that occurred 150 years ago in 1868, in September actually, in the town of Camilla, a very small town which was the county seat of Mitchell County. The African Americans of Southwest Georgia and of the entire former rebellious South had recently won the elective franchise as a product of the 1867 Reconstruction Acts, and what was then Georgia's 2nd Congressional District. They had mobilized to support the Republican candidate for Congress, a man by the name of William Pierce, who was a Union Army veteran. He was white, and a Freedmen's Bureau agent, and who was their strong ally. The Republican Party, it should be said, was new to Georgia and to the South. This may sound very surprising. Lincoln hadn't even been on the ballot in Georgia in 1860. It would have been suicidal for the anti-slavery Republican Party to go into the slave states. But Republicans had been organizing new black voters in Georgia's Southwest for well over a year, mainly through the vehicle of an organization that was known as the Union League, and its charismatic president, a man by the name of Philip Joyner, who was a former slave. And they looked hopefully to the election in what was then a decidedly black majority district. Now, nearly all of the African American men who were eligible to vote had registered to vote. I might add, in this period of Reconstruction, for the first and only time, the U.S. Army went out and registered people. You didn't have to go to register yourself. You were registered, and the federal government played a direct role. Nearly all the eligible black men were registered, and community members who were not eligible, women and children, rallied to their sides. Indeed, to get to this event in Camilla, they walked 30 miles from the slightly larger town of Albany to the north for what they called a speaking on September 19th. And as they marched, their ranks grew to about 300 as freed people left their farms and plantations where they worked and joined the big procession that was led by a wagon load of musicians playing fifes and drums. Although half of the men toted some kind of firearm for protection and for effect, most carried only birdshot. The others had left their weapons behind, heeding the advice of their leaders to avoid a provocation. Now, the question of carrying firearms suggested the dangerous and increasingly ominous atmosphere that surrounded the upcoming election. White Georgians in 1868 generally bowed to the inevitability of emancipation. After all, they had been defeated militarily in their effort to preserve slavery. But the extension of the right to vote and the prospect of seeing their former slaves politically empowered was more than most of them could tolerate, especially as it became clear already by 1868 that they could not control the black vote, even by means of the shotgun. The Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary organizations, most of which were connected to the Democratic Party, the white Democratic Party, thus spread across Georgia and many parts of the South once African Americans were able to vote. And they set as their targets, their violence was not indiscriminate. They went after political leaders and community organizers of both races. And they were especially effective in Georgia. In fact, a campaign event in the nearby town of Americus had already been disrupted a few days earlier. And it appeared that white Democrats in Georgia were more and more emboldened, in good part because they had just succeeded, with the help of moderate white Republicans, in expelling 32 duly elected African Americans from the Georgia legislature, one of whom was Philip Joyner. In their view, the right of black men to vote did not mean their right to hold elective office and rule over them. Now, some of the black leaders had warned black Republicans about a likely trap, and they urged better means of self-defense. But the initiative at the time was taken instead by Camilla's white population. They insisted, and this is their words, that an armed body of Negroes was heading their way, quote unquote, a mob threatening war, revolution, insurrection, or violence of some sort. Local Democrats, who call themselves the Citizens, determined to respond with force. They began stockpiling rifles and ammunition and appointed a committee to ride out with the sheriff and confront the Republican procession before they reached the town. The sheriff, when they rode out, put it bluntly. The procession would not be permitted to enter the town of Camilla unless they stacked what arms they had. The Republican leaders, including William Pierce, the candidate for Congress, pushed back. They explained that they only intended to go peaceably into Camilla and hold a political meeting as was, as they put it, their right. And they would continue toward the town's courthouse as was planned. Angered, the sheriff then returned to Camilla and effectively deputized the entire white male population. Now, by the time the procession arrived, amid sounds of fifes and drums, squads of heavily armed white men lined the sides of the town square. A local drunk, carrying a double-barrel shotgun and demanding that the drumming of the procession cease, then opened fire. And if as a signal, all the white townsmen joined in. The freedmen who had guns briefly returned the volleys and then, with the others, commenced a desperate flight for safety. The sheriff and his numerous deputies followed them into the surrounding woods and swamps with deadly purpose. More than anything else, they were looking for, and I quote, that damned Phil Joyner. Now, Joyner escaped, but others weren't so lucky. For more than the next week, armed white Democrats rode through the surrounding area and tried to kill off, and I quote, every colored man that is farming to himself, meaning independently, or supporting Grant and Colfax, who were the Republican nominees for president and vice president in the November election. When it was all done, at least a dozen African Americans had been murdered, and well over 30 more had been wounded. Election day, when it came, not surprisingly, proved to be remarkably quiet. Because in truth, the contest was over well before the voting began. Only 2 Republicans bothered to cast ballots in Camilla, and the turnout was so low elsewhere in the district that the Democrats, who were greatly outnumbered among eligible voters, registered an official victory. They won. It was a grisly harbinger of where Reconstruction and black freedom in South Georgia was headed. Now, for many years, and this is where I want to talk about sort of whose history is this, the bloody episode in Camilla was explained by white residents of the town and county much the way that the sheriff and the locals at the time saw it. It was depicted as a threatening invasion. We've been hearing that word a fair bit lately. An invasion by a violent mob aiming to desecrate Camilla's symbols of power and authority. And it was warded off and defeated by the legitimate citizens who rose to the occasion and protected white society. The example was of trauma faced and trauma avoided. Now, African Americans from Southwest Georgia had different stories to tell about what happened at Camilla. Stories that represented Camilla as a massacre, not as a riot, as yet another example of the brutality and repression long visited upon them by slave owners, and then former slave owners who would stop at nothing to maintain their power and supremacy. This, too, became part of a revisionist account of Reconstruction that put Republicans like William Pierce in a favorable light, and citizens of towns like Camilla in a much darker one. The interpretation was of trauma suffered and wounds festering. But the details of the events at Camilla in 1868 reveal many other things as well. And these things force us to reevaluate older interpretations and older narratives and begin to construct newer ones. And I'd like to just finish by mentioning some of these. For one, the year that this took place was 1868. Only 3 years after slavery had been legally abolished, and only 1 year after the elective franchise had been granted. But African Americans, as the incident shows, were already mobilized. They were already registered to vote. They were already loyal supporters of a new Republican Party, a party at that time understood among them as the embodiment of emancipation and civil rights. And they were already determined to put their energies, often at great risk, toward readjusting the balances of power in the South and in Southwest Georgia, toward protecting and expanding freedom and giving democracy a life it had not previously had. Indeed, what happened at Camilla suggests that as slaves, the African Americans of Southwest Georgia, and surely of other parts of the South, had begun organizing themselves in clandestine ways, had become aware of the political battles over slavery that were raging across the country, and had been teaching each other important lessons of social and political life. How else could they have been so prepared? The marching, the fifes and drums, the carrying of arms, all of this was part of a political culture in the United States embracing white and black that celebrated martial manhood. This was to be seen in militia musters, court days, and polling places when enslaved African Americans attended either with their owners or with a pass from their owners. What's more, the enthusiastic participation of black women and children who joined the procession to Camilla suggested that in politics, the lines of gender and age were not tightly drawn, that a broader sense of community tied African Americans to one another in political life, that all felt a direct stake in what was unfolding, and likely that all played roles in the process of decision-making and organizing. The links between the sort of politics that developed under slavery and the politics that could be seen at Camilla help us see another and an extremely important piece of an alternative narrative and an alternative history. We have long recognized the role that enslaved African Americans played in the destruction of slavery and in the defeat of the Confederacy. We know that the enslaved left their plantations and farms and headed to Union lines at the first opportunity. That they served as guides and spies for Union Army units, and that they eventually enlisted in the Union Army in great numbers, at least 185,000, once the federal government actually agreed to recruit them. But what happened at Camilla and what was happening under the slave regime allows us to see the actions of enslaved Southerners not just as a spontaneous response to the prospect of freedom, but as a manifestation of political consciousness, as a sign of political sophistication and awareness that we might not expect of people who had so recently been enslaved and who had been enslaved for so long. They allow us to recognize that from the time of their forced arrival in North America, slaves of African descent had been constructing and reconstructing again, not just cultures in the very broad sense, but political cultures in the sense of contesting the power of slaveholders and in seeking allies among local populations, sometimes native peoples, sometimes poor whites, and sometimes people of color who had gained their freedom. These were political cultures with local leaders, with sets of goals, with ideas of what was possible for them, and with relationships meant to protect each other, disseminate information, and accept new members who were always arriving owing to forced migrations of several sorts. This is part of a narrative that helps us see the political history of the United States as far more broadly inclusive and as shaped from the outset by those who were denied official standing in the arenas of civil and political life. And then I'll conclude with this. There was the damned Phil Joyner. Who was Phil Joyner? Phil Joyner was born a slave in Virginia around the time of Nat Turner's rebellion in the early 1830s. But he was sold off, we don't know exactly when, in the interstate slave trade and arrived in southwest Georgia sometime in the early 1850s. We don't know much about him, and there is little evidence about his doings during the Civil War. The Union Army didn't get to southwest Georgia, and so he had no opportunity to enlist. But we do know that very quickly he emerged as a leader, even though he was unable to read or write. And we know this because he gave an affidavit about the events in Camilla and signed the affidavit with an X. Indeed, by 1867, Joyner had become president of the local Union League, which was the predecessor of the Republican Party, and he was then selected as a delegate to the state constitutional convention organized under Radical Reconstruction. And that convention encoded the rights of freedmen to vote, to hold office, and to serve on juries. Democratic as his instincts were, Joyner even opposed an effort at the convention to disfranchise former Confederates. Once the convention had finished its work, Joyner was elected to the Georgia State Assembly as a representative from Dougherty County. That is before he was expelled, and then he was reseated. And he would be re-elected in 1870. When he was not in Atlanta, Joyner was at work organizing black laborers and sharecroppers for better pay and contracts, closer to home. Closer to home was near Albany, where he lived with his wife, who was a laundress, and his two daughters on some land they had managed to buy. We don't know how he managed to do this. These activities all led to his being named as the first vice president of the Georgia Colored Labor Convention in 1869. Now, Joyner did all this while courting the hostility of white landowners and Democrats who regarded him as a dangerous troublemaker and an incendiary speaker. And before long, Joyner could see the handwriting on the walls. Democrats, as at Camilla, were using fraud and vigilante violence to deny free people the political rights to which the Constitution had now entitled them, and to which their numbers could allow them to enjoy. With another local leader, Joyner drafted a letter to Congress which demanded either federal protection for their political lives and economic livelihoods in Georgia, or the allocation of some land in the West that freed people could use to their own benefit. In 1872, Joyner was defeated in his bid for re-election to the Georgia Assembly owing to the Democrats' use of coercive tactics. And so he then turned his attention to organizing what he called a civil and political association to attend to the affairs of African Americans in Georgia's Southwest. When he died in the mid-1870s, and we don't know the cause, Philip Joyner had therefore been setting the foundation for a future in which black people could push back and construct meaningful political and social lives. And as some of you may remember, Martin Luther King went there to Albany, not very successfully as it turned out, in the early 1960s, and could enable them not only to construct more meaningful lives and to push back, but also for a narrative, for a history that would mark not defeat and victimization, but strength under great duress, creativity under repression, and courage under fire. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steven. I'll ask our panelists to come on up. That would be Judy Rainbow, Jordan Smith, and Eric Grimes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them as they settle into their seats. Judy Rainbow is a social entrepreneur and trained social worker and has over 25 years of experience implementing effective community programs. She published her book, Standing in the Test of Time. Standing in the Test of Time, Love Stories of African American Elders in 2002, which was then adapted into a play. Rainbow received funding for her body of work, Grits, Greens, and Griots, which captures the narratives of multi-ethnic elders, 90 years of age and older, who are Southerners. She has participated in a varied activities sharing the wisdom of seniors and hopes to bring them honor and recognition by telling their stories. That's Judy Rainbow. Yeah, that's okay to do that. Eric Brother Shomari Grimes is an activist, author, speaker, trainer, and educator. He is the host of the Shomari Show, a weekly radio program airing on WURD 900 AM, Pennsylvania's only African-American-owned talk radio station. Grimes' primary function is developing consciousness-raising and transformative learning experiences for those committed to overcoming social marginalization, oppression, and systemic racism. He is former director of the Boston-based firm Root Cause, a consulting agency for nonprofits and other groups. His focus is developing the city strategy and support plans for the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. Eric Brother Shomari Grimes. And then we have Jordan B. Smith, new to the Widener community, is an assistant professor at the Assistant Professor of History at Widener in Chester. He teaches a variety of courses that situate the history of early America in global and Atlantic context. Motivating this perspective is his belief that we cannot begin to understand, for example, the history of slavery in the United States without considering the dimensions of the trade in humans in Western Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, the West Indies. Smith believes that tracking the vastness of early American history also illuminates the diverse experiences of the people who lived in early America. Jordan Smith. So I had an opportunity to talk with our panelists yesterday, and I said, hey, this is what we want to do. We're going to do this kind of light, moderated thing where I'm going to say as little as necessary, and you all are going to be nice to one another, just like a good, jazz band would be. So the idea is that if you ever seen a jazz band, you get 4 pieces, and every now and then somebody hits a solo, and everybody else kind of brings the bass down and brings the drum down, and somebody else comes up with the trumpet. We're going to see if that works here. So I'm going to pass the mic, because we got one mic, and we're going to see how this works. This is not a debate. This is an opportunity for us to do exactly what we've come here to do, and that is to address whose history is it anyway? And it's kind of a rhetorical question. Would you not agree? Whose history is it anyway? We will see if they agree. I don't know. Shomari just looked at me like, what? So here's what I'd like for you to do before we get into the question of whose history is it anyway. I'd like some quick reflections on the story that Steve Hahn told. Any reflections on this story? I'm going to start with the mic right here to my right.
I don't know if it's a reflection. I was struck by, does anybody know what happened in Colorado yesterday? Everybody was paying attention to the election, and it's election related, but something actually happened in Colorado. Okay. So when he mentioned the term slavery abolished, and y'all do know that that's just not true, right? America has never abolished slavery. If you read the 13th Amendment, it does not abolish slavery. And there are many states who have that same, it's called the exemption clause or the exception clause. And many states adopted that clause in their state constitutions. And Colorado is, as of yesterday, actually revoked that amendment from its state constitution, such that instead of saying, except for a crime whereof a person has been duly committed, it just literally says slavery and involuntary servitude are no longer permitted in the state of Colorado, which is going to set a precedent, hopefully, for other states to follow, and hopefully, more importantly, set a precedent for the United States Constitution to follow. And so when you talk about contested narratives, you know, the words matter and positioning matters. And so I don't know if that's a reflection, but this idea, this mythology we have, that the United States of America abolished slavery, is just that. Literally speaking, it is total mythology. And every now and then you get reminded in the way that black people are treated in this country, that there are a set of laws, a set of intentions that remind us, i.e. you saw it yesterday in Georgia, you know, the idea that the Civil Rights Bill of 1965 did not give us the right to vote. We already had that right. The Civil Rights Act was designed to protect that right to vote, and still today, those protections go limited. So it's just, you know, whose history is it anyway? It's everyone's history. It just depends on who wins the power battle over it.
I'm going to reserve my reflections for now.
I don't know if I have kind of a great reflection on this, but I think that what I got out of Steve Hahn's presentation in some ways was, again, his point that we can understand history kind of in new ways by, by thinking about kind of questions that interest us today, but in a different kind of time period. And I think that something that I got out of this talk was an emphasis on understanding that that the political consciousness of African American people was not something that was born in the Civil War, but had existed from kind of the moment they arrived in the United States. And I think that for historians, that can help us think kind of in new ways about the full range of kind of actions that enslaved people took within slavery. But it can also impact, and I think that this is where sometimes the work of historians and the work of community activists and other people who are interested in local histories and national histories can be kind of generative, because I think historians can ask these questions, can interpret events that we've known about for a long time in new ways, and can kind of affect conversations that are happening in the broader community. But I would say that in some ways, I think something that maybe we want to address as a panel is at the same time thinking about how kind of the goals of kind of what we get out of history might be different for people who are studying as historians, trained as historians, and community members. I think it's entirely useful and generative that both people can talk about history, can seek to understand history, but in some ways our goals are different.
I just want to add about the history. Oftentimes we think of history as a factual science, and it is not. It is subjective. But oftentimes when we read something in a history book, we think it's facts. But sometimes it's so laced with a person's biases and their own understanding. And so we need to be able to think critically about the information that's purported and that's shared, and where is it coming from, how was it collected, the interpretation of it. It is really it's subjective, depending on who writes the history.
So why don't we move into the next question then? And that is the question is, what is the purpose of history? Why do we even talk about history? We're in the Delaware County Historical Museum. Why is it important for us to be talking about history?
Everybody has definitions. So I think about story. Story is something that people, for me, emerge from experiences, carrying as a way of making sense. Narrative is kind of structured or socialized story for me. It's kind of where we come to a consensus about these set of stories at a collective level that we will then carry forward, because we need to have the narrative, because the narrative impacts our identity, who we think we are as a collective group of people. So that's how I differentiate those things. And I think that history is a power battle. There's an African proverb that talks about, until the lion learns how to write, the hunter will always be victorious, right? Because the hunter, the lion, he lunged at me and I had to shoot him, and he was so close, and I saw the lion was like, I was asleep, but he can't speak. So whoever wins the power battle, and so history for me is really a collective narrative that's deployed for a purpose, and that purpose is usually trying to acquire some material or immaterial power, some advantage over people, and that's what makes this important. We look in this room, and as we look out at this audience, I'm only speaking for myself, I can't speak for anybody else up here, but the fact that there are maybe 60% black people and 40% white people and 50% female and 50% male, those things, whether we want to admit it or not, we're forming impressions in our brain about who you all are as a collective group of people that decided to come and hear this particular conversation, and whether you all are the smart people for coming to hear this, and the other people who are not as smart as us, they don't have time for something like. So there are just things that go around identity and assumptions about that identity that matter based on how history is narrated.
Well, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. I am from North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, and attended segregated schools for much of my education. And in those segregated schools, there were black teachers, African American teachers, who taught us about African American history, family life, community life, political life of African Americans. And it was a multi-layered experience. In a certain year, the schools were integrated. And we no longer had that multi-layered African-American experience because the African-American history got watered down to slavery and the Civil Rights Movement. Nothing in between. Now, my mother happens to be 100, born in 1918, and her experiences were a part of my identity. Yet, when I would challenge teachers, once the school was integrated, about this multi-layered experience, they would tell me, well, go find the history and share it with me. It wasn't there. It wasn't there. It was in the collections of the families who my parents talked about, who they knew. So I will say that North Carolina is trying to correct that by collecting the stories of African Americans, and I'm working on a project, a history project, documenting the stories of African American elders, because it's a gap in the history. You would think that there was no in-between history in the early 1900s, but my mother, whose cognitive memory is very vibrant, continues to tell the stories. So, again, who has the power? At that particular time, they weren't interested in our stories because they wanted to continue to tell their narrative, which they thought was superior and more important.
I think, Julie, your story is really interesting because I think it also reminds us of the power of collaboration between communities and scholars, whatever kind of form that takes. And I guess I would also share a story from my research, which I think gets kind of, in some ways, to the point of what I think the point of history for me is. A lot of my research concerns slavery, or the period of slavery in the Caribbean, and I've done research in Barbados and Jamaica. And when I went to Barbados and I was studying how, or kind of the production of rum on sugar plantations staffed by enslaved people in the 17th and 18th century. While I was there, I also visited the Gay Distillery, which is a distillery that its history goes back to the 18th century. And outside of that distillery, there's a mural that says, "We are the story of rum." And it shows the names of people working in that industry today. The names are of their surnames are of their enslavers to this day. But the mural and much of the story of kind of rum production in the Caribbean is couched in kind of a story of celebration. And I don't think I'm not a member of that community. It's not my job to think about or to tell people how they should commemorate their history. But I think that my goal when I do research in those communities and when I write histories is to tell good history. To use my skills as a researcher and as a writer to kind of understand how rum production and how kind of a system of slavery functioned in Barbados. And I think in many ways my goal is to understand the past, to understand in some ways how we get from one point to another. But I think that, again, talking about this collaboration again that's possible and that can be generative, my hope is that perhaps some members of kind of Barbadian communities will read that history and will be able to kind of learn more about their own histories and kind of historical memory from that history, and that can kind of empower communities and help improve textbooks or improve how events are remembered by a variety of people.
So can we jazz it up for a minute? I'm just curious based on what you just said. Because there seems to be a sensitivity that you have about, that experience. And so I'm wondering, like, as I sit here and I'm watching George Washington, I know a lot of black Washingtons, and we know why. And I'm looking at William Penn. I'm wondering, I guess for me, like, how does that same sensitivity translate for someone who has to, somebody told a story about finding arrowheads earlier that are, thousands of years old. That's a lot of money. Right? Whose arrowheads are they? Who gets to own those? And I'm watching this white guy with the Braves thing, and then I'm watching those indigenous people there, and I'm thinking about who gets to profit from their history, their archaeology. So I'm just wondering, I think for me, the challenge is about where does the sensitivity get applied and not get applied in these moments of contested history? Because, George Washington just was speaking to me for a minute.
I don't know if I have a great answer. Maybe I'll see if kind of somebody else wants to jump in. But I think that again, and this is perhaps a cop-out of some way, but I sometimes kind of see the value of kind of again interpreting the archives. Is obviously I'm influenced by sensibilities of the modern day. My research questions that I think we're asking might not have made sense 40 years ago, right? But at the end of the day, I try to interpret the documents, and obviously there is subjectivity within that. But I think that as a historian, sometimes what I want to do is I want to kind of retell these stories, interpret these histories, and then let others kind of do what they might with them.
But you know what they're going to do with them, though. See, that's my thing. We know what gets done, like he gets sanitized because historians create the gateway to sanitize that story. And then we kind of suffer for a long time. I grew up thinking this dude was a hero. He's a founding father. Until I find out other things. So it's almost like finding, no, I'm just having fun with this. It's like finding out Santa Claus is not real. And to me, the historian, I don't think you get to wash your hands of your role. Not you personally.
No, but I also think that I would argue that historians kind of working in universities are trying to make George Washington a more complex figure. In their scholarship, and there are a couple of my students in the audience, and I think they would agree that, we talked about, is the American Revolution in fact revolutionary? How do we square the fact that George Washington at the time of his death, owned or controlled 317 people, with the fact that he had kind of this formative role in the U.S. government? I think that we can learn a lot from the complexity and kind of revel in the messiness of this history and try to understand and interpret it.
Well, I would just add briefly that, history is struggle. And one of the things that's happened is that the universe of actors who we consider to be significant in history has expanded enormously. And what we know is that history is about interpretation. And it's about looking at events from multiple perspectives. And it is central to the way in which political struggle goes on. I would just simply mention, since we just had an election, that I don't think it's unreasonable. I think this goes to a point you had made earlier, which is whoever owns the past owns the present. That there's no major political movement, struggle, or anything that is not infused with a historical perspective. Make America Great Again is an interpretation of history, whatever individuals who support that view think what again is, right? When again was. And one of the things we have to recognize is that movements of opposition, if they're to be successful, have to construct their own histories and have to make those histories persuasive. And one of the problems we've been facing is that that hasn't really happened very, very effectively. And so, again, I think history is sort of this ongoing process, and it's everybody's. It's not just the job of those of us who have gotten degrees and write scholarly or popular history. History is for everybody. History is a way of learning. History is a way of asking questions, and history is a way of encompassing, connecting up past and present. And it seems to me that that's one of the things sometimes we lose sight of, but that's why there are huge struggles over the teaching of history in the schools. Yes. Because they know that the kind of textbooks that are used, the kind of frameworks that are established, end up having much deeper significances than I know my students, when they leave my class, pretty much forget about 99.9% of the things I was trying to teach. But there are things that stay with them. And certainly when you're looking at public school, or even private schools, but early on through high school, those kind of frameworks and the question of who is admitted and who is sanitized are really crucially important in our ability to construct alternative histories, and in ways that I have not figured out at all, how to give those alternative histories public traction. I think that's our job.
So the question comes up to me is particularly many of us who were not were not accepted into universities, but who gets to interpret our stories? So I recently, in fact today, was sent an email, and it was about sexuality and slavery, reclaiming intimate histories in the Americas. So we have not yet begun to peel back the layers around sexuality, sexual exploitation during slavery. And so this book is by two African American women who use slave narratives. Now, and they say in this particular book that the narratives were often read by the enslavers. So I guess the question for me would be, who gets to interpret my story? Would I want my great-great-great-grandchildren interpreting my story? Or would I want the great-great-great-grandchildren of the enslavers interpreting the story? We get to a point where we think that somehow people are divorced from their biases. Coming from this as a social worker, as a therapist, I have to excavate my own and do a deep dive into my own narrative and my own biases in order to be able to assist another in excavating their own. So I guess the question for me is, who gets to interpret my story?
And also, who gets the rewards of the story? I work in a nonprofit field, and the whole industry is about storytelling. You write grants and RFPs, you can call them whatever you want to. This is a story, and the publisher is the person with the money. They kind of like say, okay, I have this $100,000 grant to give you for the purpose of at-risk youth. And then you have to go write, this statement of need called, let's make these at-risk youth as bad as possible, and let's convince them that I'm the hero in this story. My organization is the reason, that I'm going to come in and save these at-risk youth of Chester. And so you write this history. It has a lot of numbers, 90% of these students come from single parent, and this is the currency of policy and nonprofits. It's the currency, and we now have a government that has abdicated its responsibility to equity. It doesn't do homeless funding, it doesn't do education. So the nonprofit industry is now competing over stories and another form of capital called relationships. And so it's not only who owns the story that they get to tell, it's like actually who owns the story. Who owns the rewards that come from the story. And if I want to tell a different story about myself as an empowered black man with agency, but it goes against the narrative you need to tell because you got to make me as diminished and pitiful as possible so that you can get that money. So this is a real life, this is not just history, this is real life, present day rumbling we doing right here. This is a fight. And I want to have that messy conversation because there are victims and there are victors in this fight, and we need to do a better job of really owning our intentionality in this space.
Shomari, let me ask you a question in that same vein. So, to what extent are the people, the teachers, the politicians, the organizational leaders, to what extent are they responsible for straightening out history when they know it's wrong, when they know that they are hustling a story? To what extent are they responsible to say, okay, I'm not going to teach that, I'm not going to say that, I'm not, because if one of the questions that I have here is, what's the role of local journalism and local historians and this stuff? And if all politics are local and everything starts right here, how do you hold them accountable?
The truth is, it depends on which side you're on, and that's why I don't want to leave the political context. Now, people at their core, for me, and I'm not a geneticist, I don't really know this. Just the story I tell myself, are wired for three things. You're wired for story. That's how your brain processes stuff. You're wired for connection. Nobody's made to really be alone. And you're wired for identity. And those things relate to each other. And I think that, depends on where people stand, what their allegiance is to. Now, my thing is, if you say you're about something like equity or justice, social justice, then you have a responsibility to undo, these sanitizing stories that disarm people. You have a responsibility to do that. And it's funny because when I teach, most people say, wow, you teach very hard. It's like, what age should a student be before they're receiving what you're teaching? I'm like, prenatal. Because my thing is, if this is the Terror Dome, you have to be equipped to understand how to navigate this space. But I think that's the core issue to me. We are living in a time when they're literally sanitizing books out of Texas that are going to be used in schools to teach history. And we know this. They're sanitizing slavery. They don't even want to use the word slavery anymore. And so it's not like this is a historical conversation. This is a real present day thing coming off of a movement in the 80s and 90s that we call the cultural identity wars, where people who were considered Afrocentrists were trying to tell stories and say we need to, and this government, this Department of Education and Bill Bennett and all kind of people came down politically on that movement and said, no, the Egyptians were not black, and no, slavery wasn't that bad. And now we have what is called a counter-narrative movement to literally have my children or people, young people who are not yet born are going to get a very different understanding of what actually happened to the indigenous people of this country, to, the enslaved people of this country, that slave owners are going to be like, look at that. I mean, look at that. That dude's a slave owner, but look at the picture. I act like y'all know what I'm talking about. He's right there, he's talking to y'all. Imagine with that stoic nobility for people need to understand that the reason he was the general of the army and became the first president because he was the largest one of the largest slaveholder landholders and had the most to lose if they lost to the British. So economically speaking, he and his wife were the largest people-owning people and land-owning people in this country, and therefore it made sense to put them at the front of the politics. What happens when you're not telling that truth and you just look at this guy like, yes, that's what, I know I'm babbling, but I love it. That's Fela, who's an African Afrobeat artist, has a song that says, I know we gentlemen at all. So even the word like gentleman is insulting when you understand that in this country, because we didn't have an aristocracy, that the gentleman that they're referring to is the aristocratic slave owner, the planter. So when I look at a jar of Planters peanuts, and I know who the southern planters are, that offends me. But we don't teach it, so we don't even know to be offended. I can stop here.
I'm not part of the panel.
But you want to get an opportunity.
I just have to say one thing.
By the way, if you all don't know, this is Lori Grant. For those people who didn't hear her name earlier, she is the executive director of.
And
I don't care about George Washington. I'm just using it as an example, so don't get too defensive.
I can battle, but I'm not going to tonight. Tonight, I'm just going to say, as the executive director of a historic society, I want you to know I have absolutely no background in history. I'm not a historian. My areas of study are anthropology and law. This exhibit that we have here, I've only been here 6 months, has absolutely no research in it. None. I wouldn't let anybody do it. It's totally off the charts for a historic society. These are gifts that are given to us, and if you look around, there's no explanation. I want you to look at it and interpret it how you see it, what your biases, what your background, what your story comes, how your story is told from what we're just showing.
Right.
It's just to show.
Yes.
So what else would you have a museum do if they have these artifacts? It's not meant to offend. If it was meant to offend, it would have the false history attached to it.
So that's what, I'm owning my story, right? My narrative, and you're owning yours. And that's what I say, at the end of the day, you say, whose story is it? It's everybody's.
Yeah,
There's
no story attached.
I just happen to be on the program, so I get to articulate mine.
I just want to speak up.
Okay, thank you. And I think the question was, what obligation do teachers,
Yes.
politicians, and
Yes.
the like? Well, my just experience is that they don't know the history, and so they, we're become a society of sound bites, and those sound bites are, again, are not multi-layered. But I will say, there's a teacher back there, I think I see her head, Twyla Simpkins, who is a local Chester teacher who I've worked with on a project who was very committed. So I think it's by person, our ability to really sit with the discomfort of the truth is one of the reasons why people don't want to go there. And we are a country of denial. And we create these characters like Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, Jim Crow, rather than really dealing with a capitalist society or market economy. And who's Jim Crow? And so, one of the ways in which we kind of disguise our hurt and the depth of our pain is by creating these characters. And I think that if we begin to sit with the discomfort, much like a therapist does with the client, the Me Too movement. How do we begin to sit with these stories in such a way that we can hear? I went to a play on Sunday, which was a reenactment of Eugene de Klerk and South African, and they talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the story about the woman who wrote the book, who was a South African black female and the head of the police chief. And their capacity to sit with hearing the atrocities that happened to black people in a country that was dominated with black people. And the minority were white people, yet this group of people had power and just did these horrible things. But we haven't done that here. We have not excavated our souls to bring out these events. And so what happens when we're trying to, the revisionist history, when we're trying to go back and tell, we've got to talk about the pain. If we don't talk about the pain, let's get real. Things will continue to happen. But again, I think you asked this question about the teachers, the politicians. I think we've all bought into this collective amnesia.
I'm going to answer this question pretty shortly, but in kind of three parts. The first thing I would say is I'm really kind of leery of when politicians talk about history, because then we end up with people taking DNA tests to improve indigeneity, or we end up, again, talking about what makes America great again, without kind of talking about who America was great for at any point. And so I think that one of the things that this leads me to think about when we talk about the schooling, both at the university level, but also at a lower kind of education level, is it's not just about teaching the facts, but it's teaching about thinking for yourself and kind of the skills necessary to interpret. And so that would be something that I think that as we kind of work and collaborate with school systems, again, not like looking at it at a picture of George Washington and suggesting that there are different ways to read that image, and that perhaps, and that they can all be kind of simultaneously true and untrue. The final thing I would kind of add on that, and again, this is my first time kind of at the Delaware County Historical Society, and this is not meant as something directed at the Delaware County Historical Society, but I think that cultural institutions, one thing that they can work to do is make sure that the representation of their collections that they're showing, again, gives opportunity for people to interpret other kind of stories. And again, I don't know, I haven't even looked at the collection here well enough to kind of make a judgment. But I think, again, I think this is a really interesting and thought-provoking piece on the wall. But I think that there are also probably interesting pieces and photographs in the collection that tell a story of kind of African-American kind of activism, ingenuity, and other kind of parts of Chester's history.
I'm going to, Mr. Hahn, I don't know what you're going to answer right now, but when you get an opportunity, I want you to speak to propaganda in history.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. One is that I don't think it's our responsibility, not the responsibility of our officials. We make it their responsibility. But to give you a sense of what we're up against, here's some of it. Professional history writing in the United States and everywhere in the Euro-Atlantic world emerged in relationship to the rise of the nation state. And one of the things that anybody who looks at the course offerings in college or textbooks in high school knows that history telling is associated with nation states, which makes it very difficult to tell the story of people who are not directly related to that history. This is one of the political things that we have to deal with. It's also not insignificant that major changes in interpretation of history, you can call it propaganda, you can call it bias, you can call it prejudice, but history is about interpretation, have come in the midst of massive political movements. You know, the civil rights movement made possible a massive expansion of how we think about the history of the United States. Without that, there's a dynamic relationship between political mobilizations and intellectual and historical mobilizations. That's how our sense of the past, and that's how our sense of the relationship between the past and the present develops. One just quick point. You know, I could put up another very regal painting of the father of the Second Republic of the Western Hemisphere. It's a painting of him on a horse with military garb and epaulets. His name is Toussaint L'ouverture, and he was a contemporary of George Washington. He was born a slave. He was emancipated. He became a leader of, and then the leader of, the only successful slave revolt in world history, that not only overturned slavery on an island called Saint Domingue, where it was the greatest sugar-producing area in the Western Hemisphere, but because of their success, Napoleon sold off the Louisiana Territory. The whole history of the United States was changed by a group of slaves in Saint Domingue. This is about competing narratives, and it's not about blotting this out or changing it. It's about expanding it and giving us a context that ordinarily it doesn't have. And this is up to us.
My radio, I just, see, I like mess, so I'm having fun. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, maybe you are comfortable. My radio station is in Philadelphia, right? When I found my radio station, it's literally right across the street from Penn Treaty Park. So I'm trying to figure out, I see these images in Philly. And so, like, you know, who owns that story? Because we got our own Penn Treaty Park.
And we
See, but we have a real park. Y'all just got a piece of paper up there.
We brought that piece of paper to the park. Look, this is.
If you all want to stick around for how this ends, we can do that later. This is something else going on up here. I want to see if we got any questions coming from out here. And I would prefer them as questions first. I know what happens in these moments. People say, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. What I would like to see is if you got any questions for our panel. We're going to start to wrap this up. This has been fun, and of course, we never have enough time to have this kind of fun. Do we have a question? Yes. And for whom?
Everybody.
Okay.
It started as a comment, but because I'm not allowed to comment, I'll put my comment in the form of a question.
All right.
Why did I hear Chester mentioned 4 times?
Say that again?
I didn't hear the word Chester 4 times.
You said you did not?
I only heard the word Chester.
And so what's the question?
The question is, why did I only hear Chester mentioned 4 times?
Somebody want to answer that question? He wants to know why he only heard it. So is this, are you implying that you should have heard it more?
I came here tonight, supposed to be Chester, unless I'm not that erudite, I thought it was maybe the history of Chester or anything having to do with it. And I already know where, prolifically speaking, I already know what they're going to answer.
You already know the answer to this question?
Yeah, of course I do.
Hey, wait a minute. Do you mind answering the question?
But I'm going to hear their narrative.
Okay.
Which I'm going to tear that page out of my dictionary and watch my own comfort. But anyhow, that's just me talking.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
I just wonder why I hear, if I go to Domino's Pizza and everybody thinks I'm pizza, I'm like, where am I? And I stand here tonight, I can appreciate everything that was said, but by the same token, I thought this was kind of be directed more towards Chester, where I'm a native of, and I used to work in this building and all that, so I would appreciate that, but I didn't hear that, so I'm just wondering.
I'm going to tell a story about Chester.
Huh?
I'm going to tell a story about Chester.
Please do.
Okay, so in 2016, the Chester Housing Authority, where the Ruth Bennett homes exist, wanted to retell the story of a Chester resident, Ruth Bennett. There's a house, Ruth Bennett House, and I think it's on 2nd Street, and we were trying to recreate who this Ruth Bennett was. Who was she? So I worked with a team of people from, I see Deborah here, Twyla's there, I see Steve in the back. We were working to recreate this story. So we came where? Here to the archives to research, to find information about her. There was nothing. Oh. She said it's not true. There was nothing that we could find about who Ruth Bennett was. This was in 2016. It's not true, but at that time we couldn't find it because we would have included it in the film. And so what we did was we talked with people from Chester, like Sarah Finley. I can't remember some of the other elders who knew her personally. And Twyla, I'm sorry, I think we may have found something. But this was, where do people whose story are missing, where do they take their story? And I think because of the political and social aspect of race in this country, African Americans are still suspicious about how our stories are shared and interpreted. So we're not so generous with just turning over our information, and because we may not know how it's going to be used or interpreted. And that's unfortunate. So, I mean, we're still new at this process of understanding one another. So that Chester story, I'm here again. I was here last week at the same building working with Twyla Simpkins about the story of the YWCA and the story of African Americans at the Y and their experiences are missing. Where do we go as African Americans to a public place in Chester to find our story? Where would you suggest we go?
I hope here. I hope people bring it here. We only can have what people bring.
As we get ready to wrap up, we're going to be passing on some evaluations. We're going to get those passed out now. I'd appreciate it if you all would take the time, as we're doing a few more questions, to fill out these evaluations and turn them back over either to Lori or Taylor or somebody else. Somebody else want to answer the question as to why we only heard the word Chester a few times?
I guess my quick answer would be that I think, and we could have another conversation about the history of Chester, and I think this would be a place to have that. But I think what I got out of the keynote talk today, right, is that Chester's history is related to these other histories. That if we're going to understand the history of Chester in the 20th century, we have to understand the Great Migration. And I at least came a little bit closer to understanding the Great Migration tonight. So I think that obviously like having an hour is not enough time to get to the bottom of Chester's history, but I do actually think we're talking about issues kind of politically and historically that matter a lot to the community.
Yeah, and I think the dialogue focused on history. You know, you said Domino's Pizza. We didn't talk about Domino's, but we did talk about pizza. It was, Chester's history. We talked about history. And for me, I was drawing intersects. I mean, for the intersect about being from Philly, and we have a William Penn or Penn Treaty Park, and I know that William Penn has a history that's here. I went to Morehouse College. In my mind, we own Dr. Martin Luther King's story. So to come here and know that Dr. King has some formation and some formative years here, I mean, that's a conversation, right? Because as a Morehouse College Tiger, to kind of have the debate with people about where King was formed, so I think that there is spaces, and what I was just trying to do is draw visual intersects to how that locked. One of the things about Chester for me is I think that when we look at warfare now, one of the visceral stories about Chester for me is when some of these abandoned public housing places were used as military testing grounds for the same type of urban warfare that's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq right now. But I will push, having done a lot of these panels in different ways about a Chester story and the stories of Chester, I think that part of it is, this is going to get ugly.
Not for me.
Because I think that for me as a quote unquote outsider, I'm intrigued. I've always been intrigued by the stories, the defeating stories that Chesterites tell themselves. And I can only talk about black Chesterites because that's who I circle around. So if it's different for other people, I can't acknowledge that. And so it's almost like an invitation not to talk about Chester, because the way Chester talks about itself is not inviting. And so I would like to explore, maybe I'm just making that up, but I would say with a person who has a 20-plus year history of doing different things in Chester, that is something that I grapple with. It's almost like the ground is set for us not to really get serious about what this place offers the world, both in and of itself, its own internal identity, but its identity at a larger level. And I don't know that the on-ramps for that conversation are as clear sometimes, and then it gives you an invitation to kind of go beyond. But I do appreciate your point, and I think it's true.
Other questions? Yes. And are you directing them at anybody in particular or at everybody?
I'm directed at anybody that is writing district. To what degree do you think that we are constrained by primary sources? I'm asking that in the context of, I'm doing some research work on Old Third Presbyterian Church on 9th and Potter Street. There's a effect that you might see in there again and again and again. This is a Gothic church, a Gothic church. Okay, no dispute. Well, where did that come from? It came from a news article that was published in 1895 in the Chester Times. By all stretch of the imagination, the place is not a Gothic, by any definition. But they didn't know what to call it at that time, and it was also an advertisement to the rest of the public to kind of calm them down because it was a very different building. It was a modern building, and it was a modernist building, but they had to sweeten it up for the public. So for the rest of the narratives that I've read over and over again, all the way up that Wikipedia articles, it's called a Gothic building. In your experience, how have that idea of this is a primary source, so this is better than looking with your own eyes and your own analysis, how is that conflicted?
Somebody wants it?
Yeah. Oh, you're right.
All right.
I mean, I think that what you're speaking to is obviously primary sources aren't necessarily correct. You know, you can look at two newspaper sources that are going to describe things very differently. And so again, this kind of question that I think is a skill that we want to continue to develop in our communities is the interpretation, right? Like not just believing whether or not it was written at the time or in the present day, not just believing what we read. I think again, a point that Julie brought up earlier that I think is a good point is that we can think really broadly about what primary sources there are. We can think about images, we can think about buildings as primary sources, we can think about oral histories as well. And so again, we're definitely limited by what sources there are, but I think that there's fertile ground to expand what we're interpreting as historians.
Other questions? Any other? We got one right here.
That's the way for Steve. You mentioned during the time of the riots in Camilla, I think you asked, how did these black people buy property? I'm wondering the same thing because my mother is 93 and her parents came from Virginia when migration, and both maternal and paternal grandparents bought property around the same time, and I know they couldn't read and write. And my mother is collecting tax money from the heirs to keep the property. So I'm just wondering, and so she knows she's got track who's living what line, and every year she calls them up and they send there $10, $15 to pay the property taxes. I'm just wondering how they paid for it.
Yeah. You know, that's a really great question, and obviously one of the issues is that most people who were enslaved came out of slavery with nothing. Of course, they were property, and property can't own property, right? There were a number of things that were possible. One is that it turns out that because of an informal economy that emerged under slavery, slaves were often able to accumulate small amounts of property because of what they grew on their provision grounds, about their ability to trade with one another, sometimes even trading with their owners. Sometimes former owners or other whites deeded small amounts of property. Now in Philip Joyner's case, He owned only, it was only a small plot. And I don't know how he got control of that. But there are cases, and over time, the second half of the from slavery into, the 1910 is the high point of black land ownership in the South. And it's because with enormous effort, African Americans as families and communities did whatever they could do to buy land, because buying land meant that their dependence on white landowners would be at least alleviated to some extent. So we still don't know enough about these very early years and those few, because there was no land reform. There was a possibility of land reform, but that sort of went by the wayside. Some African Americans were able to claim and effectively set up as landowners in certain areas on unenclosed land. This became a sort of a site of enormous conflict. So little by little, there's a whole variety of ways in which small numbers could come into possession of property. Sometimes these created bitter divisions among African Americans themselves because of different amounts of property that they were able to bring into families. So it's an important question, but this is where we do research and we try to find out, because there are records on the ground of sort of deeds.
My mother has gone to the courthouse and she has a copy of the deeds, and one property is 30 acres, other property is 80 acres. So I'm just how we got,
Well, what year's the deed from?
About 1870.
Oh, real? Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit to that. I'm working on a research project about the South, and I don't like to even use the term the South because people think the South is homogeneous and monolithic, and each state is very different. But just to add another layer to this kind of land ownership in the South, if you were a descendant of a white land-owning family, oftentimes they gave their mulatto children land. And so you had African Americans owning large swaths of land because they were descendants of white slave owners. And so we haven't had that conversation even amongst African Americans about who gets what. And land ownership is really around capital and property and power. The second thing is, as I'm delving into the history of each state, some states are much more restrictive around land ownership. My parents moved from South Carolina and Georgia, my mother from rural Georgia, because in that particular area where she's from, African Americans could not purchase additional land. In Atlanta, it was county by county how they divvy up or how they determine land ownership and purchase of property. So it's really, you have to delve deep into the laws of that particular time. Whereas in North Carolina, my parents bought property in the 40s. And they could do that. The laws were less restrictive in North Carolina. So each state had a different set of laws. And in some states, it was county by county.
We got to start wrapping it up, folks. It is, I see a hand up right there. I actually see 1.5 hands. That's 2 now. But we do have to start wrapping it up. We are going to get those questions. Those will be the last 2. I just want to let you all know that after this, we've got a lot more to do with Chester Made. We're actually working on a project about William Penn and Penn's Landing. The Penn's Landing that is here in Chester, where Penn landed in the Penn's Landing.
That's according to you. We got a different story. That's all I'm saying. And we bigger, so
we're okay. They told me to say this. Right, we're that's real funny, man.
I don't know no parts of that story.
Whatever. So we're going to be working on a number of stories around histories in Chester specifically, like Penn's Landing, like the Deshawn Museum. Like, there are a lot of stories that we want to tell. We're working on some really great video for that. I want to thank you all for being here. Steve Hahn, Judy Rainbow, Ron. Again, it's getting late, but if I could get those real quick questions from the back there, starting with, yes.
So what we try and do is answer your question and ask my own question at the same time. All right?
I'm sorry, what is that?
So, question.
Yes.
When you were talking about the history of that segment in Georgia, you also brought up the fact that a lot of white people who came together with black people also brought up the fact that there was a history of spies and everything else that worked with the Union. So my question is, recently, as we start talking about history, or black history, we tend to omit a lot of those narratives from both sides, both against black progression or for black progression. We always talk about the narrative of slave, without bringing up all the random little people in history that actually did thrive. So, if possible, how would you be able to push that narrative back into history, hopefully in schools?
Well, look, that's a huge question. Well, let me give you a quick answer. One of the things we have to recognize is that African Americans saved and recreated the country. The history of the United States is deeply indebted to people of African descent doing all sorts of things. And so it seems to me that part of the answer to that question is to ask, how did that happen? What did they do? And what difference did it make? It shifts the perspective from the top down to the grassroots and tries to figure out what was it about their own political sensibilities that encouraged them in circumstances of great danger to draw on resources and experiences and activities that they had been engaged in and to decide to devote them to a different kind of cause. And it seems to me that that's part of the way of retelling what we think of as a familiar history from some perspectives, and all of a sudden you have a much bigger history that you need to tell, that you need to tell.
We got one more question, and I'm hoping that...
Can I add that one little answer the question real quick? About,
I'm catatonic.
when we talk about what is history.
Let me get to the question first. Let me go here first. Is that you, Titus?
Yeah, that's right.
What's the question, Titus?
My question basically was, because of the panel, you guys have done research in history. Moving forward, how do we embrace some of the history that we've already had and encompass that into what we're doing here and even our city and our community here in Chester?
One of the things I do, they call it, the technical name for this participatory action research or some form of that. The best storytelling I've ever been a part of is when I really worked with a group of young brothers from Philly, and I had them do their own research, tell their own stories, make their own videos, do their own advocacy on the issues that they defined for themselves. And it was called, as part of a documentary piece that we did called First Person. Caucasian brother, dude that I worked with, his name is Ben Hurrell. He had done a video, a documentary about the fact that there were 6 black students graduating from high school. They were in a college preparatory program, but none of them made it on to college. Some of them ended up going later, but none of them went right from high school onto a college campus, even though they were good students as part of this program. So then we created this participatory action model where young black males began to go and try to seek answers as to why. What were the structural reasons that happened? So they got a chance to interview their peers, they got a chance to interview politicians, they got a chance to deal with the head of the school board, tell their own story. And I think that if you create those opportunities where people can begin to really detail and tell their own authentic stories from their perspective, but at a level where they got to engage with multiple stakeholders at multiple levels, and then understanding that at the end of the day, that might not be the truth, but it's their truth. And so to begin, what does it mean to have young people see themselves as citizen journalists, to see themselves as researchers, to see themselves as the evaluators of the programs that other people get funded for, right? How do you change the paradigm when you, going back to this key word for me, we're just trying to create structures where people who are encountering these spaces have a sense of their own agency and their own storytelling power, so that stories don't always have to be imposed on people. They can actually create and germinate their own.
I would just like to add that
You all are not trying to go home.
that, you know, with the advent of technology, oftentimes the stories of folks 65 years of age and older are left out because the dominant story becomes the youth story or the young people's story. So let's not forget them, particularly African American elders and that aging population, because their voice is definitely not included in the narrative that exists.
I'm gonna keep it to one sentence. I think showing up to events like this, because that creates more events like this. I think reading, there's a lot of good history from different perspectives out there, and you can kind of learn from others. And I would also say collaborating. We have different strengths, we have different perspectives. What I've appreciated about this panel is kind of the give and take. And, you know, again, you can reach out to people who kind of have different perspectives, different abilities, and together you can kind of continue to learn, continue to process.
I was just going to make one quick suggestion for anyone who's interested, because the issues we've been talking about tonight were addressed in the 1930s by W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote at that point a book called Black Reconstruction in America. And it's a very long book. It's still ahead of its time. But the last chapter is called The Propaganda of History. And Du Bois is taking on the question of why it is that the story he's telling is not known, and how it is that professional historians have managed to ignore and overlook this story that could be staring them right in their face. And, you know, it's really, I mean, as many of you know who have read his work, he's an incredibly powerful writer as well as a deep thinker, and his book stands out. I mean, if you saw what else was being written about Reconstruction at the time, you know, you would sort of be aghast. And it's also a way in which that book was hardly reviewed any place. And it's a reminder that a lot of the pioneering work done in the history field by African American writers was ignored and only rediscovered later in the midst of political struggle.
What's the name of the book?
Black Reconstruction in America.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. Yes. You can say it now.
This event to me, it's always a good event when we get people together that have different opinions and different perspectives on things. I see in this room, and myself included, everybody came here with an expectation on what the history that would be talked about would be. I hear this gentleman say why wasn't Chester mentioned more than 4 times. I'm in the background saying why wasn't Chester mentioned more than 4 times. I know what I want to see and what I want to hear as far as history of Chester may be different than what he has or what he wants to hear. But how do we take everything that we have from every person in this room, where is it a space that they can drop that history in? Because all of our history may connect. Our grandparents may connect. But where is that connection at for all of that history? I see you pointing and I see you tapping. But with you tapping and you pointing, but us not knowing, we don't know where to drop that history at. Because I would like to know what piece is missing that he wanted to know. You know what I mean? And where does it all connect at? And I see a void right now, but I see meetings like this pulling stuff out.
Right,
and
right.
I just wanted to commend all of y'all for sitting up there because we had some questions that you didn't answer and we have some information that you may need to know. And I think it takes both to make this thing happen.
And I think, Devin, also it's important to know that everything doesn't have to go to them.
Yes.
So we've had conversations, many conversations in the past about organizing this, and this is one of those events that's organized on top of something else.
Yes,
so for some people, this is new. They're like, oh, this is brand new. I'm like, no, we've been doing this for a little while now. And we're inviting you to be part of this going forward.
Right.
So we can't answer everything about Chester or anything else tonight, but we will be doing another event, and you will be invited to that event. We ask you to come out, and you can help us frame what that discussion is versus showing up and saying, hey, what do you got to feed me tonight? We're like, nah, you can actually help us cook the next time.
And I'd be more than willing to throw my little radio spot in as a amplifying and articulation space, because we look for regional stories as well, and I think that we also want to consider that who gets to hear the stories that once they get in that pot.
And I think it would even be good if you say that Chester is the original Penn's Landing on you.
I'll create the space for y'all to say.
All right, we really gotta start wrapping it up. We are.
What's the name of his radio station?
WURD Radio.
WURD.
WURD Radio.
Like word. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Hi, my name is Judy Rainbow, and I feel honored and it's a privilege to be here in Chester. I've been working on projects in Chester since 2016, and I'm an oral historian, and I document the stories of elders. And how do we begin to amplify the voice of the African American elders in Chester and include them in the story? Oftentimes the marginalized stories don't ever come to the surface. So how do we begin to go back and collect the stories that really bring a broadness and a comprehensiveness to the Chester story? I am excited to see such a well-attended event. People are interested in learning about how to capture Chester's story, and I'm glad I could participate. Thank you.
Greetings, my name is Eric Grimes, also known as Brother Shomari. I was one of the panelists today for the conversation Chester, Whose History Is It Anyway? And I felt it was a very lively conversation, a very much needed conversation. And I think when people hear the word history, we think that that's something that only old people get to talk about. I would love for us to be real intentional about figuring out how the young people in Chester can come into this conversation and share their thoughts about the history of this place, both at a local level and then also how we take that history and make it stronger and louder and prouder at a global level. So shout out to all the people who brought this together.
Hi, I'm Jordan Smith. I'm an assistant professor of history at Widener University, and I found today's panel really interesting. As a newcomer to kind of the Chester community, I was really interested to have a chance to meet community members, activists, and think about how history means different things to people who grew up in Chester, who work with people in Chester, and also people who study history, and kind of that's their primary occupation. I thought I saw fertile ground for kind of collaboration between people with different stakes in the history of Chester and the Philadelphia area. And I also thought that Steve Hahn's talk on kind of Reconstruction and African-American political activism in the aftermath of the Civil War was particularly interesting and informative, and helps us think differently about kind of the life stories of people who ended up moving to Chester a generation later.
Hello, my name is Devin Walls, and tonight was a great night for history in Chester. I listened to all of the panelists talk about history, but they spoke about it in a broader term. And then I like the way some of the audience, they pulled it back into some of Chester's history. And we had people who were born and raised here in Chester from the 1950s and 60s in the house, whose parents migrated to Chester in the late 1800s. So if you look at everything around you and you get a feel for what's happening in this room tonight, I'm feeling that we got some positive reinforcement that the history of Chester is not dead and it's still alive right here. So if you weren't here, you missed something spectacular.
My name is Steven Hahn. I'm a professor of history at New York University, and I had the good fortune of being invited down today to engage in this, very, very animated and very interesting discussion about whose history is it anyway, and competing interpretations of the past, and what history means to us, and what sort of work we can do in order to make history more lively and more relevant to us. I thought the panelists were excellent, and there were some terrific questions from the audience as well.
My name is Ulysses Butch Slaughter. I'm Program Managing Consultant for the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. We just wrapped up an event that we call Chester. Whose history is it anyway? Now, we didn't talk as much about Chester as we wanted to, but we did talk about Chester from the standpoint that it is not much different than many other places around the country. Chester is like a lot of places where people are fighting for narratives, people are fighting for power, people are fighting for resources. And I was quite pleased with the turnout. I enjoyed this a lot of good energy. I think people learned a lot, and I can't wait to do it again. And I'm going to start working on that immediately, as a matter of fact. We called it Chester. Whose history is it anyway? And I'm looking forward to doing it again.
My name is Laurie Zier. I'm Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. Tonight was a really wonderful opportunity for so many different people, not only here in Chester, but in Delaware County, to come together to talk about a very important topic. Chester's, whose history is it? That's a topic that brings so many people together because people do question, Penn's Landing, whose story? Is it Philadelphia's? Is it Chester's? We really got to delve deep into issues around history and who owns it and who can be in control of it. Our project here, Chester Made, is all about creating a platform for folks to come together to be able to tell those stories, to research them and tell them in their own words, in their own terms. And this was a great way to kick that off and continue that conversation.
Hello, I'm Lori Grant, the Executive Director at Delaware County Historical Society. Tonight we had a discussion about whose history is this anyway, and I think it was thought-provoking, I think it was a bit messy, and I think that we need more of them. So I hope that Delaware County Historical Society is able to host these because I think we're the perfect venue. We don't tell histories, we just collect them, we protect them, and we preserve them, and we hope we can share them and make them our collective history.